You've probably heard the phrase, talking about music is like dancing about architecture, a quote I've seen attributed to a number of different people. I don't think it's quite that impossible, because I've made something of a small career on YouTube doing exactly that. But it points to a bigger problem. We know what music is made of, we can describe it in scientific terms, but those terms have a couple of problems. They don't differentiate between music and noise, which most of us do, and we don't use these terms in everyday language anyway. No one is talking about scent deviations and interval ratios and spectral analysis when discussing music in an everyday context. Even those of us who are immersed, or trapped, take your pick, in the world of musical academia do not talk like this unless we have a need to be that specific. The fancy scholarly term used to describe any common cultural discourse around music is cross-domain mapping, a term brought to us by Lawrence Zbikowski, whose work Conceptualizing Music takes a long look at this very subject. Zbikowski applies a concept from the work of George Lakoff and Mark Turner, whose work in cognitive linguistics focuses on how our brains understand the world through metaphors. According to Zbikowski, cross-domain mapping is a general cognitive process through which we structure an unfamiliar or abstract domain in terms of one more familiar or concrete, and allows us to ground our descriptions of elusive musical phenomena in concepts derived from everyday experience. I like to think of cross-domain mapping as an extreme form of analogy. An analogy that everyone in a society buys into, and whose citizens rarely, if ever, stop to realize that it is an analogy. Take this sequence, what we call a rising scale. What does it mean for this scale to rise? Rise is just one part of these big analogies, which maps pitch, scientifically frequency in cycles per second or hertz, onto height, in feet or inches, or whatever it is you Europeans use. Scales don't just rise or fall. We say that the melody reaches a high note. We speak of the top and bottom of an instrument's or player's range. We even write our music in this way. Pitches with higher frequency are further up on the staff. It's been this way since the 10th century, when practices of notation began to emerge and the concepts of high and low meant something on a physical page. Over a millennium later, this metaphor isn't just going strong, it's baked into our language about music in a way that's hard to consciously disentangle. So why do we do this? It's natural to perceive pitch as both a continuum and as relative. Almost everyone is capable of perceiving differences in tone, and most are capable of detecting very slight differences, but most people don't have perfect pitch. And even if everyone did, not only would the world be 9.5% more annoying, you'd still probably find the same societal use for the application of terms about height onto terms about music. But this is not the only system of cross-domain mapping. We can begin to pick at why Western terminology is what it is by looking at how other cultures talk about their music. In Indonesia, pitches are not high or low, but small and large. Small items make higher sounds than larger ones, and this makes sense if you look at gamelan ensembles, where many similar-looking instruments occupy parts of a large range of pitches. But why did this terminology evolve in Java and Bali when you can make the same observation about, say, the Western string quartet? These are three similar-looking and similarly constructed instruments whose main difference is their size, which correlates to pitch exactly as one would expect. So what prompted one culture to look for size and another for height as the best metaphor, when metallophones from both are oriented the same way, from left to right, low to high, large to small? And what does it mean when composers who are not from Indonesia use deeper instruments to evoke larger things? Are they using in that moment an Indonesian schema for mapping one concept onto another? Well, no. These metaphors aren't the only ones we use for music. Cross-domain mapping tells us something about the default metaphor in a given society. Other metaphors are pretty digestible, and it's easy to understand how they apply to concepts like musical pitch. Anything that's a spectrum can be mapped onto the pitch spectrum. If you understand high and low, there's no issue in thinking of pitches as large and small, or vice versa, or even as heavy and sharp, as the ancient Greeks did, or dark and light, like I just made up. Cross-domain mapping can be trickier when the metaphors are overly specific, but this can also help us understand musical cultures that are far removed from our own. Zbikowski cites Stephen Feld's research into the Kaluli people of central Papua New Guinea, who use waterfalls as a metaphor. Their terminology is specific when it comes to what we think of as descending gestures, but they have no words to describe ascending ones. This broad analogy of water to music is in some ways the same as the Western view. After all, the metaphor of descent is correlated with a Kaluli metaphor for a descending waterfall, but this cross-domain mapping extends beyond pitch to the realm of rhythm and meter and even bodily movement. According to Feld, the Kaluli have no term for unison singing, and indeed never sing this way, despite having a clear concept of what unison singing is. It's just unidiomatic. The metaphor of water in Kaluli music is so all-encompassing, it extends to their closely canonic textures, where multiple singers sing the same thing in very close succession with no one person designated as a leader. When we look into cross-domain mapping, and keep in mind I've mostly just talked about metaphors for pitch in this video, it's a chicken or egg question. Was the Kaluli people's water metaphors so strong that unison singing did not develop because it didn't fit? Or did the water metaphor evolve to explain the characteristics of an independently evolved music? I suspect it's a little bit of both, but I don't know for sure, and we cannot take the origin of the Western metaphor of height as the model here, because as far as I understand, the Kaluli do not have a system of musical notation. What they have is a very particular environment, limited to the slope of one dormant volcano on a biologically and linguistically diverse island. It makes sense, then, that however this cross-domain mapping arose, it did so to fit a very limited geographical space and a small number of people. The more people, the more land you take up, and the more languages that are spoken, the broader the metaphors have to become. So the next time you're talking about music and you use the default terms of your culture's metaphors, think about those metaphors for a little bit. And think about how your thinking about music is shaped by the terms that you unconsciously use. About how composers from different cultures will write music that uses these metaphors. It's second nature for many of us to use ascending or descending scales to represent a rise or fall in physical space, but what does it mean to hear a similar sequence in gamelan music or recreations of the music of the ancient Greeks? These people are not working with the same conceptual frameworks as somebody like me. The question is not just for talking about music, but cross-domain mapping informs all sorts of musical and compositional choices, in any context where the composer is trying to represent something else. You may perceive music differently in accordance with whatever you've mapped onto it, and it's an interesting challenge to try to use this knowledge to hear music through someone else's ears, someone across the world or even across the centuries.